Hello everyone, welcome to our fifth video lecture on visual methods for social science research. And for this lecture, we'll talk about ethics in doing visual research in the social sciences. So in this lecture, we'll talk about basic principles of research ethics. That will be a review because maybe you have discussed about this in your high school. And then research ethics as applied in visual research. So what are the particular research ethics that are specific to doing visual research? And then we'll look at the particular nuances when doing informed consent process and media release process when you are doing visual research. And these are going to be our sources, and I expect you to read them. So basically, when we talk about research ethics, there are general ethical considerations that encompasses most research studies that involve human participants. So basically, as researchers, especially in the social sciences, we have to act with integrity, and usually we look at the general ethical frameworks, general moral frameworks in our culture, but at the same time we also look at the code of ethics that is found in your particular profession. So if, for example, you're a sociologist or social scientist, maybe the Philippine Sociological Society or the International Sociological Association has its own code of ethics that it follows. And also you have to look at legal frameworks in terms of how to act with integrity. So of course you have to be legally bounded to the country that you are doing your research in, and also the policies of the institutions where you're doing research in. So for example, you are doing research as an affiliate of a university, the ethical policies, the privacy policies of that particular university or college will guide your acting with integrity as a researcher or a scholar. And then more importantly, when you're doing research involving human subjects or any human identifiable data. This includes, of course, any form of organ or tissue that is taken from humans, but of course that's more in the realm of biology, but also other materials that we found in the world that come from humans, like for example human data that are archived in social media, for instance. These are not necessarily humans, but this data is derived from humans. So we also have to take care, we have to respect the rights of humans and respect the rights of the humans that generate this data. So we respect both the humans that are currently engaged in our project, being interviewed, being surveyed, but also respect the humans behind the data that we're getting, especially when this data are archived. So also the two general ethics, but of course we'll look into the particular ethical considerations later. But why are we talking about, research ethics, and why is research ethics important? So what are the legal basis for this? So basically in 2012, the Commission on Higher Education, the Department of Health, and the National Institutes of Health has put forth a joint memorandum saying that all students and all faculty members who are producing research in a higher education institution such as our university, they have to, and if they're using human subjects, human participants in those research, they are bound to subject themselves for ethical review. So in the university, we have a research ethics office, but at the same time, in our department, we also have our own research ethics protocols, and we will be talking about this when we meet in class later. But basically, that is where this is coming from, and why this is a highlight when we're doing research. Why we have to think about ethical frameworks when you're doing research, because we are legally bound to do so. And then when do we think of research ethics? So sometimes researchers, especially the novice ones, when they do research and they apply ethics, they only think about the ethics during the beginning of the research, and then when they implement it, no longer. But according to solid ethical frameworks. We have to look at research ethics as we prepare the research. We have to observe ethics as we do the fieldwork. And even when we analyze the data and present our findings, we also have to be ethically upright. So let's look at the basic ethics principles that we expect in a social science research. So the first one, and more importantly, every time you do human research, human participant research, you have to secure informed consent. So basically, informed consent means that participants involved in the research should have the right to voluntarily participate. So there should be no form of coercion in the form of them getting punished or them getting disenfranchised because they did not join the study or they would not like to join the study. There should be no coercion in terms of paying them money or paying them high grades because or affording them promotion because they are willing to go to be a part of your study. So although rewards or stipends are okay, it has to be commensurate with the amount of effort that is expected in the study. But you cannot use rewards or very high incentive mechanisms, that are very exorbitant for you to make people join your research, because again, that is a form of coercion as well. And of course, aside from that, when you talk about consent is the voluntary part. They have to consent to be a part of your research. But another part is also informed. They have to be informed that they are going to be a part of the research. They're informed that you're doing research. They're informed that there's going to be a study that's going to be made in the data that they are collecting, right? And then they should know their rights as participants. They should know the procedure, the risks, the benefits. So that is informed consent, and there's a particular process wherein we take informed consent. So what are informed consent concerns that are particular to visual research? And the first one is whether or not you are trying to do overt or covert methodologies. When we say overt methodologies, this is the type of research wherein the people involved in your research know that they're being researched on. And this is usually the type of research that we do in the department. People know that they're being researched on. But there are also some researchers who do covert methodologies, meaning the participants do not know that they're being researched on. And usually, if there are no high ethical or there are no illegal stakes to this, then usually it can be allowed. But there are really thick ethical protocols for you to follow if you want to do a covert methodology. So an example of a covert methodology probably is you're doing big data analysis. For example, you're mining tweets, for you to be able to see network analysis on, let's say, the visuals that are being used to represent the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, and the misinformations found in the visual posters being given out in a particular disease. So those are covert methodologies because you're working with anonymized big data. You don't have the luxury of getting informed consent of every person on social media in a particular geolocated area. So you may be allowed to do some form of covert methodology to extract the data if you're allowed by Twitter or whatever platform you're working on. So, but of course, that's not going to be a part of what we're going to be doing in this class. We're going to do more overt methodologies. If the methodologies are more overt, of course, we expect to secure informed consent from the participants. Second, making sure that the participants are informed. And this is, again, very important, that informed means that they have been told of what are the different, tenets of the study, from the objectives, the procedures, the risks, the rights, their rights for privacy and confidentiality, and the responsibilities of the researchers. But informed also means that they were able to comprehend. They were able to comprehend the details of the study. So it's important, especially when you are talking about you're moving across spaces wherein, let's say, you're working with participants who may not know how to speak in English, they only speak in the vernacular. So the informed consent form or the informed consent process has to accommodate their language needs, their particular language needs, their particular comprehension level needs. So yeah, so that is what we mean when we say informed. Sometimes, if we're really strict about it and we're doing really, really intensive interview work, we actually sometimes have to quiz the participants, before they sign. You allow them to ask questions, and then you can also ask them questions about your study to just make sure that they understand the study. So the informed part of the informed consent must be um, observed, and must be assured. Next, of course, is who provides consent. And, when we're talking about generally healthy adults, they can provide their own consents. General healthy adults, age of majority. But of course, there are certain sectors of people who may not have that luxury. Like, for example, if you're doing research, on children, you're doing visual research on children. For example, you wanna analyze their artwork, and then you wanna have them talk about your artwork. Or for example, you're video recording their activities in class or while they're in the playground. That they are not adults, so they have to have parental consent. And parental consent is, in the Philippines, there are legal frameworks in terms of who gets to get parental consent, but usually, it is the mother. Is a usually the legally binded one to give parental consent. Although, of course, in general, if the stakes aren't so high, we're good with any parent. Um, and also, there's also what we call child's assent. An assent is an informed consent process that we apply to children as well, because although we are allowing the parents, or we put primacy on parental consent for the minors, but also when the child can already decide from themselves, they can already comprehend some form of understanding about the world, they can also assent. So usually, if the child is between 6 to 7 years old, they also receive a paper. Yung language is usually put in their level. Of course, it's different from what the parents would get. It would usually accommodate the level of understanding of the children, and they will also have to agree or sign with it. And then for those that are 5 years old and below who can't read and write yet, usually assent is usually verbal, or it can also be non-verbal. Like, for example, if you are engaging the child, and the child is uncooperative, then that behavior of being uncooperative is a form of a dissent from the child. So if we're really very strict about it, consent should be both parental and child's assent. So parental consent plus child assent is the requirement. Next is, of course, the nuances of when you are not really photographing yourself in the research, but you're photographing public places, and you are, you are able to get faces of people who are anonymous. Um, uh, there's no hard and fast rule regarding this. You have to abide with the code of ethics of your discipline, and also with the code of ethics of your university. Look at the policies. You also have to look at the policies of your country in relation to making use of photographs in public places. There. Next, of course, pictures and taken by or owned by the participants. So when participants take their own pictures, they also you're also delegating them the consent to get the consent of the people that they are taking. But there are ways for us to be able to address these things. But yeah, and then of course, pictures taken by owned by the participant, like copywriting, ownership of those photos. There's so many legal implications in relation to this. But definitely, what is important is that for working with photographs, the general thing is that the people whose faces and identities can be seen in the photograph, they have to consent that their pictures are being taken off. they can, and then if they have to be published in the actual report, because sometimes we just take pictures and we just analyze them and we don't necessarily publish them in the final report. They're just analytical materials, but they don't get published in the final report. So there are two layers of consent there. So are you consenting to have your picture, this picture, be used in an analysis, a picture of you that identifies you to be part of the analysis? And then the second tier is that, do you allow, just in case we choose this picture to be a part of the publication, do you allow? So yeah, so that's that. Those are some of the ideas that you have to take into consideration. And then, of course, we also have to, related to that is, of course, media release. So how do you formalize that process of, having the person being, covered by the picture, express their consent to be a part of the analysis or a part of the publication, and that is through the use of a media release form. So they, aside from the informed consent, they also can sign the media release form that you are allowing the researchers to put your pictures in analysis and to put the pictures in the publication, just in case. No, but that is not like both. No, some could just do not, no, put me in the analysis, but I don't allow you to publish this research. No? So those kinds of things. So what are the different components of an informed consent form? So again, so the informed consent process is that you recruit the participants. After you recruit potential participants, you provide them an informed consent form. And also, if this is if this is outside a survey form, which is easily understandable, you usually have to sit with them and talk to them about your procedure so that they can fully understand, and while they're holding the form. Ideally, when we provide them the form, we give them around 24 hours to read the form, to digest the form, and the information in the form, and so that they can make informed decisions about it. Maybe they have to ask someone else for some sort of advice if they want to be a part of the research or not. No, that's why it's very important that we don't really dwell with topics that are so sensitive that we don't really have credence to do. It's because that will kind of compound the ethical process, the informed consent process. So, and now what should they be seeing in the form? So basically, general thing is that it's important that they comprehend the form. So it has to be written in a language that can accommodate to the literacy needs. So of course, if you're talking to teachers, then maybe you can just do standard English, it's fine. But if you're talking about like general adults, then there are really strict ethical committees, real ethical review committees, that maybe you should also have this in the vernacular. And of course, if this is, of course, you are also targeting, let's say, for example, a particular linguistic minority or a different linguistic group, then you also have to accommodate their linguistic, their own language. So, yeah, so those are, generally important things, because you have to make the informed consent form understandable. Right? For big research projects, they even sometimes have a video explainer, but I won't require you to do that for our particular fieldwork. But, they do that as well, so that, there's a multimodal way of doing your informed consent, so that just to make sure that your participant understands, or your potential participant understands it clearly before they volunteer to be a part of the research. Now, volunteering to be a part of the research does not guarantee that they are legally bound, to finish the research. For survey, it's quite easy, because if they don't want to be a part of the research anymore, they just don't continue answering if they started answering the survey. But for example, for research wherein the participants are expected to engage in longer period of time, like for example in a photo voice or in a photo story research, then they have the right to drop out anytime, and they can still receive the benefits that are being offered by the research, and they cannot be punished for removing themselves from the research even after they've signed the informed consent. So what are the different things that we have to see in an informed consent? So you can look at samples, and usually what we use is the WHO sample. They have the World Health Organization as a sample, but it can be really cumbersome. It's really best for research dealing with health, but you can look at the components of that. So So what we see, of course, the title of the study, your name, the name of the research, the researchers, their affiliation, their contact details, and of course, if you're doing this as a student, your mentor or your professor also has to be a part of this thing. And then you declare that this is a research. You are asking them to be a part of the research because there are many activities wherein you get data, but this one particularly is a research, and they should know that you're doing a research and that they are being invited for the research. And then of course you give them again the objectives of the study. You just don't copy paste your research questions. You have to again you articulate the research questions, the study objectives in such a way that they understand and accommodates the language needs of your particular research participants. And then of course you grade 6 level comprehension of explanation of the study procedure, their potential risks. Now, what are the different potential risks that are found in your study? And there are, there is for social research, it may not be as risky as let's say health research, wherein they can get some sort of physical or biological harm. But there are different types of risks or harm that are found in research. The first one is psychological harm. Is there any possibility that the participant can experience some form of emotional distress because of their engagement in the research? Like you're talking about abuse, you're talking about suicide, you're talking about depression, anxiety, experiences of loneliness. So this can be emotionally triggering, and it's very important that when the researcher identifies a risk, the researcher has offers a way to address it. So probably if the researcher is not a psychologist, the researcher offers to link the person to a psychologist or a counselor or a psychiatrist for that case. Now again, another would be economic or financial risk. Like for example, if you're asking the participants to come to your venue to have the interview, you have to pay for the participants transportation fees. You have to give them one meal if it's a 1 or 2 hour research. Usually provide them money for transportation going to and from the venue where the research will be done, and also at least one meal. Usually in my case, I provide money. I provide money for transportation and food that they will be taking in the transportation, and also provide food at the venue. Again, because addressing physical and financial risks, you just don't say na I identify these risks, but what will the researcher do to identify those risks? Another would be social risks. Like for example, you're doing research on HIV and you're doing this really large recruitment. So if they become a part of your research, then people would know, this person has HIV because that's a part of that person is engaging with these researchers doing HIV research. So those are social risks. So usually the researcher addresses this is through really strong promises and commitments and procedures to protect the person's anonymity and confidentiality throughout the research process. And that's the reasons why for our class, and usually this is an undergrad class, we're just going to be dealing with general healthy adults who do not experience any form of disease or infirmity, so that we do not subject them to these unnecessary risks that will entail the researcher to do some form of reparation just in case these risks come to fruition. And of course, you have to give them the benefits. What are the different benefits of being a part of this study? For health research, usually you get access to medicines, you get access to healthcare. But for social research, what would that be? So usually for survey research, you just say there are no direct benefits from the study, but you also provide indirect benefits. Like for example, what we will learn from this survey can indirectly affect you by informing policymakers to make improvements as a basis for what we are able to find out in this particular survey. But there are also particularly for visual research, and photo stories and photo voice and photo elicitation and generally qualitative research, what I identify as a benefit is that that ability for increasing self-awareness, Because when you try to, intently look back on your life, you intently look at your social relationships, you get to know yourself better. And I feel like that's a very, that's an intangible benefit that you can get when you engage in research, Um, yeah. And then it's also very important to ensure confidentiality. How do you get the data? How do you store the data? How do you anonymize the participants? You're not going to use their names. You're not going to use their addresses. They're not going to be mentioned in the study whatsoever. If you have to identify a particular participant, they have to be assigned a pseudonym or a participant A, B, C, D instead of their names. And then, for example, in my research, I cannot post their pictures, their faces particularly. I cannot, and then there was one time that, in a research, they post in front of the house, and then in that house, the house number was caught by the picture, so we had to blur, we had to cover those numbers, because again, those are identifiers. And then of course the question of where will you store the data, who will have access to the data, is this protected by two-factor authentication? And then, of course, you have to cite the national and the university data privacy policy in the informed consent, and how do you address them. And then again, you declare that the participation for the study is voluntary, and that they can withdraw from the study anytime. And if you promise them transportation fees, they don't lose the transportation incentives or the meal incentives just because in the middle of the research, ayoko na. They said, I don't want to be a part of it anymore. I will not give you transportation. No, that's not allowed. You still provide them with the incentives that you promised when they sign the consent in the first place. And then, of course, there should be an additional layer that, you are participating, that the photographs will be released, and that you are transferring the copyrights to the researcher. Because that's important, because it's only when the researcher has the copyright for the pictures that they can really do whatever they want with it in terms of publishing eventually. Again, if they don't, then it's okay. They can take pictures, but you don't have copyrights for it, so you cannot publish their pictures. You can probably just use them for analysis. And then of course the statement of consent. There's a statement says that to paraphrase that, I have read the above terms and I understand the study objectives, the aims of the study, the procedure, the risks involved, and my rights as a participant, and I am voluntarily subjecting myself to be a part of the study. And then there's a signature. Sometimes they will require you to have a witness, but sometimes they don't, But, there's a consent. Usually in my case, if I'm working with another institution, the institution is the one witnessing. And then, aside from the informed consent form, you also have to have a media release form. So I found a very simple one from the work of Hans and Parlio. You can probably use this, and basically consent for taking and using my picture. And then, you give all of the, where will you be publishing them, and that they're consenting that these pictures will be published just in case you choose to be a part of it. So then they print, sign here, and the date. So this is very important. Each photograph you take should have a media release form. Another way, of course, is listing down all of the pictures. But again, that's also unfair to list down all of the pictures and then just sign. Because sometimes, they just don't want to give a blanket media release. They want a particular, I consent for this picture, but this picture I don't. So if you've taken 10 pictures over the course of the research process, you get to make them choose which one they get media release form. So if you have 10 pictures, they have to sign 10 media release forms. This is also very important when the researcher takes pictures. For example, they're doing photo voice or photo stories, and they're taking pictures of people around them. And the faces of the people around them are, very distinctly seen. It's important that they also take the release form of the people part of their picture. So you teach the participant. So I'm going to give you a bundle of media release forms that are blank. if in the process of you taking pictures as a part of the study, will kind of need to have people to be a part of it. The people who are part of it needs to sign media release forms. That's very strict. So there are possible ways to go around those things. One is that you don't get people in the pictures. If you will get people in pictures, usually they are side view, or you just take their back so that their faces don't get seen. And so when that case happens, you don't have to get media release forms anymore, unless they are really, wearing something identifiable, or you're in a place that's identifiable. So those are very important. Or for example, the participants will blur the faces. But again, that will require media release forms. Remember, in our publications, usually, even if they consent, we blur the faces or we cover the faces to protect their anonymity, even if they consent. So that's like the safest way to go. Now, another ethical principle is non-maleficence, or the absence of harm. So all steps should be taken to avoid any form of harm on the participants, whether that's physical, psychological, legal, financial, or any foreseeable type of harm. So legal, for example of a legal, so I've talked to you about, physical, psychological, financial, any earlier. Legal, an example is, for example, you are doing research on, let's say, people who use drugs or people who inject drugs. So there are legal implications to that. Are you going to protect them? Because this is a legal risk. So again, there are layers. You have to talk to your university and to the legal code in relation to whether you are allowed, to do that. But definitely there are those areas that, the researcher has no choice but to report it to the authorities. Like, for example, when they see child abuse, there's no way that the researcher is culpable to report those things. Yeah. Next, very important, is privacy, anonymity, and confidentiality. So privacy meaning there's nobody else who can be the people who are not related to the research cannot be there and hear or see the data as it's being collected. So that's privacy. Anonymity meaning there should be no picture, no text, or no data in the study that can be connected to a particular person whose identity is known. So that's anonymity. So usually what we do is we anonymize, or we don't collect data in the first place that will get identifiable or private information like names. So when you see a survey that asks for your email without any explanation while they're taking your email, when there's no follow-up, they're taking your number but there's no follow-up, or there's no price in the end, or they're taking your name or your address, like your particular address, your location, sure, like what region are you from or what city are you from, that's fine. But if they're asking your actual line address, that can be a violation, because I don't think that your address or your name is needed for to increase the insights that can be gained from the study. Okay, so that's anonymity. You cannot any form of data cannot be assigned to a particular person, and that's very tricky when you're doing data mining in Twitter. It cannot be searched. So if you use Twitter data for your analysis, and then you have to paraphrase the tweet, because if you don't paraphrase the tweet and that tweet gets searchable on Google, now that links to a particular account which is linked to a particular person. So you have to paraphrase if you're using Twitter data. Although we're not using that, or any Facebook posts, text particularly. So that's anonymity. That's why, for example, in our research, we don't use their full names. We just assign them pseudonyms. And then confidentiality is more of, once the data is with the researcher, how does the researcher protect it from leaking out? So data privacy, data security, what are the different authentication measures that you have to follow? Sometimes it's really very strict. But for me, the safest is limit the access. The only persons who have access would be the mentor, the research supervisor, and the researchers themselves. No one else. Number two, aside from limiting the access, you have to make sure that there should be two-factor authentication. So if you're storing it in Google Drive, there should be two-factor authentication. So there should be a password and there should be another way to authenticate, probably through text message. I don't know, based on you, no? Then all precautions should be taken to ensure that, privacy is protected, identity information should be anonymized, and then confidentiality and security of information should be prioritized. Now, in the pictures, how do we also promote that? So I've explained earlier, we can blur or pixelate the faces, have persons turn their backs, or if it's not needed, don't include persons in the pictures anymore. Okay? Next, as we explained earlier, sometimes informed consent can be very tricky if you do covert observation or deception. Deception, as a general rule, we only use deception if we feel like if there are no risks involved. Like if you deceive them and then they get hurt or they get harmed because of that, that's not really good. There should be no harm in deception. And if it's only needed, like for example, you feel like the behaviors would change if you don't do covert. But that you really have to justify that to your review committee, to your research supervisor, whether that could be said. But in my case, if there should be really thick justification why you need to do things covertly. Probably you need to do things covertly because your presence as a researcher will modify their behavior and you want them to act as authentically as possible. But those are really for very particular specific cases, studies of behavior, which again, in our case, in the projects that we're going to do, it's more reflective than really observational. So, yeah. So there should be, justifiable or theoretical, theoretical or methodological reasons for, reasons to lie or deceive. And usually there is that process of, post informed consent. Like there was a covert observation in the beginning, but you reveal yourself eventually at the end of the study and say, you know what, I had been researching, I've been taking videos of you, and do you consent me for me to use these videos? If you don't consent, I will delete it in front of you and you'll not be a part of it. So that's another, a delayed consent may also be, something that you want to do. Remember that the deception or the coercion should not, be in a way introducing any harm to your respondents. All right. Also, again, going back to, privacy and confidentiality is that, for example, you're requiring them to take 10 pictures. The pictures that taken during the research does not automatically be a part of the data analysis. Usually there's a second layer. Of course, you've taken 10 pictures in the span of this photo voice or photo story protocol. Now, tell me which of these photos do you want to include. So there's a second layer of consent. So you ask them to choose the pictures that you want them to be a part of. So you really have to clarify those, procedural nuances when you're explaining your process. So usually for photo voice, for photo stories, this is like your usual survey wherein you give your consent form, you let them read them, and then, they can get back with a good decision already. But this one, they can have questions. So you have to be there to be able to answer their questions. Next, very important is vulnerability to understand. Vulnerability is, some population have special needs or consideration which mean that extra care should be taken when doing research. So one, what are the different forms of vulnerability? So we've discussed that earlier, like minors, they're vulnerable because they're not, legally bound to make decisions yet from themselves. What are other forms of vulnerabilities? Those who have chronic illnesses or disabilities, like if you want to study about people with diabetes, study with people with disabilities, automatically they're vulnerable. The very young and the very old. So people ages 60 and above, they are vulnerable, right? And there should be extra care. Like for example, the procedure that you expect is going to be easy for adults, maybe a little bit harder for older adults because they have physical limitations already. So you have to put them into account. How do you address the vulnerabilities and the extra risks that they have because they are older? Another is for people who are belonging in institutions like prisoners, those that are institutions like, for example, you want to do study on priests, nuns, the military, because they're institutionalized, their autonomy is lower, their ability to decide from themselves is lower, because, for example, nuns, um, priests, and military, they are they have the duty of obedience. So they can be coerced by their higher ups, to be a part. So that extra care is provided, if you wanna like do. There's a particular like a whole ethical chapter, specifically for institutionalized people, adopted people. Sorry, in those in adoption centers now. So these are, we will not be having a time like a full time to be able to discuss the nuances of this, but in general, they need extra care. And of course, we also talk about those who are, based on their identity, they receive some form of minoritization in society. Like we talk about indigenous peoples, they are socially marginalized. We talk about gender and sexual minorities. They are also minoritized, so extra care is provided to them. And then we also look at socially, um, we also look at people who perform socially deviant behaviors, like people, commercial sex workers, prostituted women, people who use drugs, etc. So just in case you want to study about deviant behaviors, but there are extra again. The protective mechanisms you have for general adults is going to be twice or thrice or thicker than when you have or when you do research on these vulnerable populations. And that's the reason why I discourage undergraduate students to do research on vulnerable populations, or those people who experience vulnerable situations, because it needs expertise, it needs a thicker form, an organized form of protection that sometimes undergraduate students may not, one, have the expertise to do, number two, don't have the resources accessible to them, so that just in case needs arise for these participants, you can access them. And in visual research, the vulnerability is extra, because there can be pictures that can put them in bad light, right? So you really have to be very careful. And then maybe you wanna do online research ethics. So this one I got from the to be amended National Ethical Research Guidelines. So they have a full chapter just talking about internet research, and basically these are the things that you have to think about when you're doing online research. And this is not just doing visual research. Maybe you can also apply this when you do online survey, particularly, or online interviews. One, the digital tools or platforms you're using is the best platform. Like, maybe don't use Facebook Messenger to interview. That's not like the best platform. It doesn't give, although of course if that's the only thing that's available to the participant, then why bother? But if you have access to Zoom, then that would be a better platform, I guess. And then maybe there are like questions on, if you want to study about like pictures on the internet, persons on the social media, there's an interrogation of why use Twitter, why use Facebook, right? So there should be like some sort of justification why I'm analyzing pictures on Facebook, on Twitter, on Reddit, on Instagram. So there should be some justification of that, and also why all of them, if that's if I'm ambitious like that. So the validity and the reliability of the digital platforms used must be justified. Next, there should be reliability and fairness of participant recruitment. Meaning, if you can, maybe you don't just limit yourself to social networks. Maybe you can do Facebook page with ads that are targeted to like general, to make it a little bit more randomized. So just in case you're doing recruitment online. But I guess for our classes we don't really recruit online, but later on when you do surveys, that's very important. Next, transparency in the research process and data processing. They should know what you will do with their online data, just in case you're doing archival research. You have to know what they're going to do with it. Of course, anonymity and confidentiality forever. Now, if you're looking at like accounts and looking at visual pictures, this one is a little bit messy now. Because like in text, if you're going to analyze text, you can paraphrase the text and it's no longer searchable in Google, or maybe it's going to be harder. But for pictures, if it's public domain, then maybe there are, considerations in relation to that. But really, it all boils down to risk benefits analysis. Like, is the publication of this picture going to be harmful? If it is going to be in a way harmful, and you expect that you foresee, because these are risks. They aren't harms that are present now, but they can be present in the future when the research is being done and when it's already published. So you have to foresee those possible harms. So if this picture gets out, it gets searchable, will this impact the person who's going to be searched because of it? So those kinds of things. And then, very important, because when I started doing online research a decade ago, there was this broad policy, or this broad tenet that says that if you are studying research in a password protected account or site, then there should be informed consent being asked for the people being engaged in that project. So you have to contact the accounts or contact the administration, and you have to ask for permission for that particular community to be a part. So, for example, you have to apply to be a part of it. You have to have a password to be a part of it. Then that's a part of it. But if it's in public domain, like for example, even if I am not a Twitter user, and I can search your Twitter picture, or I can search your Twitter post, I don't have to get your consent for me to use your quote in the research, because it's public anyway. So ibig sabihin, by posting it public, you're kind of giving the consent already that people, can do research on that content. That was 10 years ago, but now we follow this. There should be some form of reasonable expectations of privacy. So, even if a person posts it online in a public domain, searchable on Google, you don't have to be a part of a particular Twitter group. You don't have to have an account in that social media to access that social media post. It's publicly posted. You also have to think about, what is the expectation of the privacy of the person posting it? Do you think the person is willing, to be researched on? Now, if there are doubts, for example, this is just a picture of, let's say, a dog, or a picture of, let's say, a person's back looking on like a site. Maybe there's no like expectations of really hardcore privacy. But when there is already like people there, faces of people, identifying factors, maybe you need to get their informed consent. Okay, so again, when there's doubt and the shade of doubt, it's better to err on the side of safety. And then again, big data and data mining ethics. 10 years ago, you can just mine data on Twitter and Facebook and Twitter, and they won't mind. But now you have to ask particularly a permission from Twitter or from Facebook for you to be able to mine their data. So again, it should be done by a professional. So there are many data scientists you can have access to for the ethical mining of the data. And of course, forever and ever, you have to adhere to the Data Privacy Act in every step of the way when you're doing research and you're using online platforms to do so. So, in summary, what are, visual research ethics? 1, you should strive to protect the rights, privacy, dignity, and well-being of those that are engaged in your study. Number 2, research should be based on voluntary, informed consent. I would like to say prior consent, unless you're kind of doing covert, but you cannot collect data until they sign the consent. Personal information should be treated confidentially, and participants should be anonymized unless they choose to be identified. But in a way, for me, even if they say, yeah, post my picture on the publication, I would, again, reasonable expectations of privacy, I would say. And then research participants should be informed to the extent to which anonymity and confidentiality can be assured in publication and dissemination, and potential reuse of the data. So for example, if you want to use the data in a different research with a different perspective in a different research question, you should have to inform the participants. So that was that lengthy discussion on ethics as applied in visual research. So we talked about, the different research principles, and then we also talked about the informed consent process, the importance of media release process, and we also talked about the different nuances when you're doing online research and the ethical considerations that you have to think about when you do those types of research.